even though I'm not talking about group policy today, I thought this t-shirt design would be appropriate. This is a t-shirt I did a few years ago when it was clear that Microsoft was, let's say, not committed to group policy as a technology, and there were other things that were being foisted on us, and they were trying their best to kill it. That pretty much hasn't changed in the last 3 years, other than the fact that pretty much everyone on the planet still uses group policy. So I thought it was kind of an interesting thing to share at this point. But I am happy, in the spirit of community, I would be happy to answer questions about group policy. So what I'm going to talk about today is identity governance in a hybrid identity world. And in the spirit of Gil's comment on the first day, this is really my kind of experiences. I mean, this is not like 20-year-old stuff that we're doing here. This is all new for a lot of people. The concept of hybrid identity is new. The concept of identity governance in this hybrid identity world is relatively new. And so I encourage you all to participate in this conversation with me. I don't want to just be standing up here and talking about my experiences. I'd love to hear what other people are doing in this area as well, because it's a learning process, I think, for all of us. So I'm going to kind of throw out some ideas, talk about some, kind of best practices or things that I've seen that worked or don't work, and then I encourage everyone to kind of add to that. So I am Darren Marlia, head of product at Semperis, also known as GPO guy. I will never live that one down. I started a website called gpoguy.com, but I actually do, and I used to be a Microsoft MVP. True story, after 14 years, Microsoft, in one fell swoop, I call it the June massacre, obliterated every group policy MVP in the program. They're all gone. There's not one of us anymore, including myself, Jeremy Moskowitz. If you all know Jeremy, he's been around the community for a long time. So I'm a former MVP, but still helping in the community around group policy as well as Active Directory and other things. Founded the gpoguy.com website and also a company called SDM Software. I've spent at least half of the 35 years I've been in technology as an IT person, working for mostly big companies like Charles Schwab, Autodesk, Wells Fargo, and usually doing something related to Microsoft technology, but I've been a network engineer. I was a Tivoli 1.0 administrator way, way back. Actually, I was telling the story of that when I was at Schwab doing Tivoli, one of my coworkers in the architecture group was a guy named Craig Newmark. You've probably heard of Craigslist. Craig was a coworker at that time, and when he got laid off from Schwab, went and founded Craigslist. So that was kind of a cool story. I am super fascinated by InfoSec. I've been, I've actually had the role of an InfoSec engineer, architect. Did some work at Autodesk doing that. I'm super fascinated following a lot of the folks that are here talking around technology that helps with security. The Bloodhound guys are just, big fans of that technology. But I also do things other than technology. I race bikes. I've been doing that on and off for like 30 years. And recently, in the last 5 years, I started making wine. That's a picture of me and my son crushing 300 pounds of Cabernet Sauvignon grapes about a month ago. So that's something I enjoy doing, and I've heard people say that it doesn't suck, so I'm, at least semi-accomplished in that at this point. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of how do we define identity governance. I'm sure vendors have sought to define this for you for years, but I kind of just give you my take on what it means, and then we can kind of talk about some of the challenges of that, governance in a hybrid world, what changes, pitfalls and opportunities, and then getting to hybrid governance. So what is identity governance? Making sure, it's my definition, the right people have the right access to the right stuff all the time. And it's pretty simple, but it's obviously hard to do in practice. TechTarget has this definition that I liked, which is policy-based, centralized orchestration of identity management and access control. and it supports the enterprise IT security and regulatory compliance. So it has lots of different purposes. For sure, there's a security InfoSec purpose to it. There's a regulatory purpose to it that I'm sure a lot of you are beholding to. But practically speaking, it's a good idea to make sure. I mean, we saw that in the previous talk around Bloodhound. It's a really good idea to make sure that the right people have access to the right stuff all the time, and that's really what governance is all about. I mean, there's process. There's the standard 3: people, process, and technology around that. And products to help do it and all this sort of thing. But the bottom line is you're trying to get to that goal of controlling access to stuff and making sure that the users have what they need to do their jobs, but no more than that. So some of the pieces: access management. How do I control who has access to what? Access certification. How many of you have an active, access review or access certification process in your organization? So maybe a half to a third. So, that's tends to be. I'll talk a little bit about it some more, but it tends to be a regulatory thing. In other words, you have to show the regulator that you have reviewed access. Now, I don't know about any of you, but most of that involves sending an email to a manager with a list of people on it and saying quarterly, do these people still need access? Maybe they look at it. Maybe they just click the link and say accept. Obviously it's important, and they probably have been imparted with the information that it's important. But it's probably not the most effective way of controlling access. It certainly checks the box from a regulatory perspective, and that is important. I mean, it's a reality we all live with. Role discovery and management. So, I mean, role-based access control has been around forever. Various vendors have taken various approaches to doing it. It's a really hard thing to do. The joke is, in a typical organization that's using RBAC, you probably have at least as many roles as there are employees in the organization, and maybe more. And it's not always that bad, and some people do a better job of it than others. And Microsoft has had guidance around Active Directory and roles, create access groups and put them in role groups. It's just really hard to, and I'll go back to this a lot, this notion of meshing the business who knows the applications and knows who needs access to what in the applications, and the technology, that really needs to come together successfully for good role definition to happen, good access to happen, and it doesn't always work that way. And so, there's role mining technology you can get that will discover relationships automatically, and it's a good starting point. I think I've seen that work in a lot of organizations. The point here is that you need to have some way of saying Joe Smith is a finance person, and because they're a finance person, they get access to this list of applications and these file shares and these whatever database apps or something like that. So the point there is being able to assign a job function to access and do that in a controlled and repeatable way. Analytics and reporting, right? So I need to know, once I've done all this stuff, is it working? Do the right people have the right access? Can I show that they accessed something on a particular day and time, et cetera? And then policy enforcement and segregation of duties. This is something that I'm actually curious, have any of you implemented a separation of duties policy within your identity provisioning environment? Spotty, yeah. So separation of duties, I think I go on to define this, but the notion here is that there are certain job functions that from either a regulatory perspective or a security perspective, a single person shouldn't have. And the example I give later on is accounts payable and accounts receivable access. You don't want both, right? You don't want to give somebody both. So you have a policy in place that prevents that access from being granted, inadvertently or otherwise. So now, all of this is hard to do on-prem, and we've been struggling to do it for a long time. How does the hybrid world come into this, and how does it impact it? Well, you have all the same concerns, but now you have the governance stretches out across both on-prem identities and identities in the cloud. So I'm Darren in my on-prem Active Directory. I'm Darren in Azure AD. I might be Darren in Okta or Google ID. And my talk is really I don't assume any technology stack in this, because I know that over time, all of you will probably end up having multiple cloud identity providers for various reasons. That's the way of the world, right? We have multiple hypervisors, we have multiple operating systems, we're going to have multiple cloud identity providers for this line of business app or that app that the customer said we need to have. So the assumption here is that whatever the cloud identity provider is, I might have an incarnation of myself in all of those cloud identity providers. And how do I do governance across all of the instances of me? That is the challenge, right? That is if we don't do that, we're going to have the same problem that we had in on-prem AD, where everyone is domain admin, or everyone has more access than they need, or Bloodhound starts to discover attack paths into the cloud, which I think is a very logical extension of that tool. So this is really important to think about as you're getting to the cloud. I'll give you a good example. I did an Azure AD implementation for a customer that was an early adopter of Office 365 a few years ago. And we did the Active Directory sync up to Azure AD. At the time, we were doing authentication through ping-fed to get access to the Office 365 apps. And the ping-fed infrastructure didn't traditionally support admin accounts because we didn't want to use admin accounts in that particular context. So we synced all of our primary AD accounts into Azure AD. And then we started giving them global admin access, SharePoint admin access, Exchange admin access. So here you had what was normally an unprivileged user in AD, on-prem AD, now suddenly becoming privileged users by virtue of being in Azure AD. And obviously that is like the worst case scenario of governance, because even if I had done the job right on the AD side, and I did, I had a secondary admin account that I would use to do privileged work. But as soon as I got into Azure AD, I was a privileged user and I could do anything. So it's sort of, it's important, I think, to think about, how do you avoid the problems, the sins of the past as you're moving into this new world where you're probably being told, we need to do this fast. We need to get to Office 365, get it done. And so the default and back in the day when I was doing it, there were like 5 or 6 built-in roles in Azure AD. That was it. And so the immediate response was, I need to add a license for this user. Okay, I'll put you in global admin. And then we had like 30 people in global admin before I knew it. So I think these are the kinds of things that you have to think about as you're moving to these cloud systems. And again, it's not just Azure AD and Office 365. It's if you're in Okta, if you're in Google ID, you're doing some other B2B, B2C kind of communication. All of that has its own level of authorization, application assignments, whatever the model is that you have to think about as you're granting privileges to folks up in the cloud. One, I think, I would call it nice, but one advantage that the cloud brings, at least from my perspective, and I'd be curious to see what other people think, is if you think about the on-prem world that we've grown up in, you have applications and resources spread all over, and they're not very discoverable. If I'm in a particular AD group, then I have absolutely no idea what file shares I have access to, what applications I have access to, just by looking at that group, right? It's maybe somebody named it appropriately, and so I kind of sort of know that it's a Salesforce group or it's a PeopleSoft group or whatever your technology is, but probably not. And I have to go suss out every resource to figure out where that group has been applied. At least in the cloud, you sort of have a central point you can go to where your app assignments are done, your authorizations are being controlled. It's not as, at least I don't find it to be as daunting of a place to have to discover all of that. Have you all had that same experience? I'm curious if you've found the cloud to be easier to deal with from an authorization perspective or harder. And I think the reality is we're all going to probably be in this hybrid world for, I don't know, maybe as long as we're in this business. I mean, I doubt we're all going to get to, I've heard of very few customers. Actually, I've heard of one customer Microsoft mentioned at the last summit that I was at, where they had a customer that was actually on a path, a 20,000 user customer on a path to remove AD from their environment and go solely on Azure AD for all authentication authorization. And they were going to Intune, and they were going to the whole stack of the whole Microsoft dream. And yeah, they had truly taken the Kool-Aid, but it sounded like they were well on the way. So it is, obviously, it takes commitment, and it takes, from a business perspective, how do I justify this? Is it really providing me a business advantage? But certainly there are advantages to making that kind of like major shift in terms of getting everything in the cloud and hopefully doing it right the first time. But it's probably pretty rare. So that, yeah.
Was that using just Azure AD?
Yes. Yeah.
So no DCs?
No DCs. Yeah, no on-prem AD. They were just lock, stock, and barrel moving everything. And obviously it had to involve application work, right? Because how many of the applications?
You make things like if you have Linux servers, like we tie our Linux authentication directly to Active Directory.
That's right.
But how does that work against Azure AD?
Right, and actually Microsoft just announced something around that, right? So they just announced, I call it the PAM module for Azure AD, but essentially they announced the ability to be able to authenticate Linux boxes directly to Azure AD. And this is actually something that I tried to do a few years ago in AWS. We had a bunch of Linux boxes in AWS and we were basically using AD just the way you described. And how do you, we wanted to use cloud identity. We wanted to use Azure AD to do this, and it was not possible at the time. So I was happy to see that. But yeah, I mean, the assumption is you're going to be hybrid for a while. You may have more than one cloud identity provider. So you have to sort of look at it holistically. Microsoft may have these great tools for X, Y, and Z, but maybe Okta doesn't, or Google ID doesn't, or whatever. So I think that's my approach, or my thinking about this is it has to be really agnostic to the particular platform or vendor. So, I mean, this is fairly obvious, and those of you who are doing identity governance today probably know this. When you went out to figure out your access reviews, you have to talk to the business to find out who should have access to stuff, right? It's not just, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And this is always kind of prickly because business doesn't always tell IT everything and vice versa. They don't always work together. I mean, this is the people part of the people, process, and technology in identity governance that is really kind of, it needs to be there for this to succeed. And I think it needs to succeed, especially as you move in a hybrid environment. So I would encourage everyone that's trying to do this to make sure that the business is involved early and often in terms of whether it's access reviews, whether it's role definitions, whatever the piece of governance that you're trying to do, it just has to be a partnership. Have any of you had success working with your businesses on this kind of stuff, or is it more like pulling teeth? I see some nodding. Cool. Okay. I won't force you. Yes.
I would say that success, at least for me, has depended on if there are any regulatory requirements. So that's more of a top-down push versus a bottom-up.
Right. So that's the point there is that if there are regulatory requirements, you sort of have the big cudgel that helps to get everyone on the same page. And I think it's a really good point. I'd like to say that this should happen regardless of regulations, but the reality of it is that people aren't going to spend time and money unless they're forced to. So, my hope is that people see the value of governance, hybrid or otherwise, from the perspective of protecting the organization from threats, making sure that information doesn't get leaked out, et cetera. But the reality is that there are regulations in place to try to force this issue. So I think that's a key piece. Going back to what I said earlier, traditionally it's hard to determine where access has been granted and to whom. And access certifications or reviews are often rubber stamp. I've worked at an organization, very large financial services company where managers would get like 20 or 30 of these emails in a bulk, and have to go through them all. And okay, what does this group do again? most of these applications that are doing access reviews, they're not providing context. They're just saying, this AD security group has these members and who should be in there and who shouldn't. And without the business context, is a manager really going to remember what this group really has access to? And so, it's a great question. So the question is, how far can you go, or what can you do in this case where you're kind of assuming that when you do an access review, the person that's doing it really has the context that I mentioned, and it rarely is the case. So I think, obviously this is a work in progress. I think the concept of, the kinds of access reviews that I talked about is an imperfect system that we need to get to a place where, whether it's, I hate to use this term because it's so overused, whether we're applying machine learning or whether doing other things to determine relationships between objects in your identity systems to understand context. So if I'm granting if somebody has access to a group, as a manager, I want to know not the list of users, but what the context is of that user. What else do they have access to? What is their job function? Maybe I don't even remember that this person works for me. I think another point is there a better target for your access reviews? So instead of a manager who has a bunch of people working for them, is it the application owner, or is it somebody that has the context about what people are doing in that application? So I think I wish I had a cut and dry answer, but I think being able to provide context within the access review, so this person has this group, but they also have this group, and these are the things that those two groups give them access to, and this is what your group gives them access to. And having that context in the access review, I think, would go a long way towards making it a more meaningful process. I think eventually we have to get to a place where, again, using some kind of machine learning, or I like the kind of bloodhound model of sort of the graphing of the relationships, but it has to sort of become more automatic. Like there has to be, if I have a job function of X, I should have access to these things, and relying on someone to have to manually double check that is never going to scale. So that's kind of where I'd like to see it go, and I know that there's some vendors that are doing some of that, but yeah, it's a good question. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer. And I talked about this earlier, but role discovery and mining and definition is really hard. I have done this with limited success in some organizations. I'm curious if anyone has had what they feel like is a really good role-based access control model that they've implemented. No. I'm looking at you, Joe. No.
We have a project for that next year. It's very well funded.
Excellent. You'll have to let us know how that goes.
Yes. Yeah. Titanic.
Yeah.
Coming up soon.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the way to take this is to take it in chunks, and I think what I've seen succeed is to not get so fine-grained on the roles and try to have coarsely defined roles, and this works best, frankly, at birthright provisioning, right? So you want to have a business function defined, and when you birthright provision a new user, they get their birthright access based on their job function or role. And that typically requires interfacing with the HR system and having those well-defined roles then translate into access in your applications. Now again, this is, I'm talking about this as if there were no hybrid identity world, but if you throw in the hybrid identity world, then you have to think about, okay, birthright provisioning now not only creates an Active Directory account for me and the associated AD groups, but it also needs to put me in the proper roles in my cloud identity system, or proper groups up there as well, potentially. Now, some of that you may get for free by being in an Active Directory group. We know that technologies that sync Active Directory up to the cloud, well, that you're getting group memberships for free there. But then you have to think about, okay, those AD group memberships now confer cloud application access to me. So do I have that story right? Do I have all of those groups clearly defined in terms of what, does this AD group give me access to a bunch of on-prem stuff and cloud stuff? And is it the right level of access? So that kind of, that doing that role definition, at least at the time of instantiation of an identity, is a good first step, I think, in being able to define, maybe from there you can define roles. And it does get complex over time because, as you move across roles, what happens to your access? Does it automatically get removed? Is there a period of time where you have the access and then it goes away? These are all the things that you have to think about, again, on-prem and in the cloud. Any questions on that? Yeah. And then reporting and logging, you made the point about it being a little bit better and more discoverable, but I think we've all suffered from the overdose of non-actionable data when it comes to auditing. I can't tell you how many customers I talk to around our solutions, and I'm not pitching, but what I'm saying is we talk to customers and we say, well, you have a SIM, right? You can get some of this information from the SIM. Oh, they don't let us touch that. Or, oh, it's awful, I can't get anything out of it. I mean, that every single customer almost that I talk to, I get the same story. And so, these technologies have come into play to sort of get control over this overdose of non-actionable data, but in some cases it works great, in some cases it's made the problem worse, in some cases the data is so partitioned that the people that need it don't get access to it. So these are another challenge. And then again, okay, so I have this SIM over here collecting all my on-prem audit logs. Is it also collecting all the logs from up in Azure AD or Okta? Because I want to be able to correlate activities between the two. That should be happening, but maybe not. So I've kind of tried to talk about all this stuff in the context of cloud identity, but oftentimes I keep meandering back and forth between them, but I just want to kind of bring it back to the fact that, if you have one or more cloud identity providers, all of the stuff that I'm saying has to fit into each of their own particular models for doing authorization, for doing provisioning, for doing auditing. And so you need to examine that relationship. As I mentioned, the separation of duties question. So if you have an on-prem ERP administrator with payroll access that then gets granted an access to an HR system in the cloud, and maybe they can change pay grade, maybe that's not such a good thing. So now you have a separation of duties problem that spans both on-prem and cloud applications. And you have to be able to enforce that policy when access is granted, either at birthright or in an ongoing fashion. If they change their job function, maybe they've transferred from sales to payroll or something like that, are they getting their access revoked to the appropriate systems on both on-prem and in the cloud as they're making that transition? Or is there in that job, do they have access to those two pieces of those two applications? Is it appropriate? Or somebody, they call up the help desk and says, I can't get access to this system, and the help desk clicks on, add to group in Okta, and suddenly they've violated policy, but it's not being enforced anywhere. So that kind of separation of duties problem becomes harder. And again, if you have multiple clouds, then you have to think about the applications across those multiple clouds as well. And again, discovery, everything really, if you think about it, if I have an AD, imagine if I had 5 ADs and applications running in each of those, and how hard it would be to keep them coordinated from all of these governance perspectives. That's the problem you're sort of thinking about. The difference, of course, is that in the cloud, it's different technology. Each cloud identity platform has a different set of approaches, different APIs. I'm not naive. You will absolutely be relying on vendor products to solve a lot of this, but those vendor products have to be cognizant of all of these different cloud identity providers and being able to work within that framework. And that has to be built into the platform, right? It can't be an afterthought bolt-on thing, because if you're going to do separation of duties policy enforcement across multiple identity systems, they darn well better have that as part of their governance capability from day one, or at least well integrated once they add these other cloud providers. And I haven't really talked much about privileged access, but this is obviously, I gave that example of regular accounts having privileged access in a cloud identity system. That is absolutely something you don't want to get into, right? You don't want to start messing with privileged access inconsistently across all of these systems. So you have to get the whole PAM problem now becomes that much more difficult because there are different roles that confer different access in these cloud systems. And do you understand what that access is? Has the vendor exposed that information? I can tell you that when I tried to find out all the things that the various administrator roles in Azure AD did early on, it was like pulling teeth. And it was not documented anywhere, and Microsoft themselves couldn't even tell us at the time. I think they've gotten a little bit better at that, but there's still some opaqueness to that process. And so really understanding what privileges you're granting to privileged users is important. And this is just my really bad artistic capability here to just sort of articulate what I'm talking about. So we've got good old on-prem AD at the bottom. We've got a couple different cloud identity systems with a bunch of cloud applications. I've got users in on-prem AD. Typically, I'm syncing those up, syncing up the groups, but maybe I also have some other groups that are cloud only that these users have been granted access to, or roles. And I might do it again in this other cloud identity system. And I might have some cloud-only identities that I have to think about and worry about, right? I've got some cloud-only identities for some particular B2B or B2C application, and I have to understand how those fit into my overall governance strategy. So if they don't exist in AD, then I have to be able to address them in each of the clouds in which they live from a, access management perspective, from a separation of duties perspective, if it's relevant. I know companies that they have business relationships with companies. They put users into their Azure AD tenant that are not part of their organization, that are not syncing from AD, and do they have any, issues around separation of duties, access management, or are they just simply users that you can ignore by and large? So that's a definite consideration that you have to think about as you're going into the cloud. I'm sure, how many of you have, for those of you that are in the cloud, how many of you have cloud-only identities that you have to provision and manage, right? So I'm curious how you manage them from a governance perspective today, or is it just kind of an ad hoc process? For MIM, right? So there's some. So you're using MIM. So there's some. How do they get originated? Is there a business process that kicks off that? B2B accounts. Okay. Got it. Cool. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. And actually, I'm making this point again. I think governance now really needs to be seamlessly cross on-prem and cloud boundaries. And sometimes it is different models. That doesn't mean you can't accomplish it. It just means that you have to sort of adjust your processes, adjust your technology stack for each of the different components of that on each of those different platforms. Again, not assuming you're on Azure AD or Okta or Google or whatever, but assuming you may be on all of them. As I said, the concept of separation of duties becomes much more complex. Certification. So if you're doing certification, do you certify on the full scope of what that person or group has access to across both on-prem and in the cloud? It's probably going to be useful to do that. Today, certification tends to be very group-oriented as opposed to business function-oriented or business role-oriented. And again, I think that has to change because as you grow identity domains, your certification burden or the managers that's doing this certification burden grows, and that's probably not going to scale. If you think they're ignoring and just clicking the accept button today, it will just get worse in a multi-identity system environment. And then, again, privileged access. Having differences between on-prem and cloud identity systems is not a great solution. I keep going back to the example I gave. If I'm not privileged in on-prem but privileged in the cloud, what does that mean? What does that mean for attack paths that I could train Bloodhound or other tools on? It's not a good story. So being able to do privileged access management seamlessly across those two is really important. So what are some of the interesting scenarios enabled by inconsistent governance? Overly complex access policies. I mean, we have this today in on-prem. It can only get worse if you don't take a holistic view of this across both. Inadvertent separation of duties violations. Again, you have to enforce separation of duties policies now across both on-prem and cloud. Otherwise, it's kind of meaningless if you're just doing it on-prem or just doing it in the cloud. Inconsistent access across different domains. You're going to have, we have this, again, all of these problems exist today, and they only get more challenging when we go to the cloud. You've had, challenges with access management on-prem today. I think the cloud does a little better job of exposing it. I believe that, but you still have to deal with that in the context of who I am as an on-prem identity. Again, new avenues for lateral movement, and I'm going to make a change to this because I think I want to invent a new term. Because it's the cloud, it's really vertical movement. So instead of lateral movement, we can move up, and that's an area that we really want to avoid. Or vertical. Sounds like a heart disease. Exactly.
Because we have identity as service.
That's right.
So you can get services from cloud on-premises.
It's a great point. It is not a one-way movement. It's absolutely a two-way vertical movement. So if somebody compromises your cloud systems, they can make their way onto on-prem if it's not set up correctly from an access perspective, privileged access especially. I can't wait to see that exploit. That's going to be. I'm sure it's happening. Yeah, I have no doubt. And then lack of visibility into access usage. Again, we have a challenge finding access usage today. I think most cloud identity systems do a better job of that. But again, how do you create that end-to-end view? If AD or Okta, Azure AD or Okta do it really well, do I still have lack of visibility on-prem? Or if I'm in both AD and Okta, do they do it equally well? That's something you have to think about. You have to sort of manage around it if they don't. Keep doing that. Strategies. Centralizing both authentication and authorization as much as possible. Having one system, you talked about this, having one system for doing your provisioning, for doing authentication and authorization. Let me back up. I'm talking about apples and oranges. Centralizing authentication and authorization from a management perspective as much as possible. So if you are authenticating, if you have multiple cloud environments, you may be doing SSO in Azure AD, you may be doing it in Okta, you may be doing it through some federation product on-prem. Whatever it is, have that kind of single point of control for controlling as much of that authentication and authorization as possible. And then, from a provisioning perspective, having a single process for provisioning both on-prem and cloud access and identities so that you have a single place to look to see what is being provisioned, what roles are being defined, what access is being defined, and then you can do your governance based on that. Certifications, again, should extend across on-prem and cloud. I think this has to get there, but to the point we made earlier, it's already hard enough in the on-prem environment. There needs to be a way of improving it as we go across to these different environments, these different cloud identity systems. So providing more context for those access certifications, especially if you're talking about this cloud application and that on-prem application. And then privileged users are privileged users wherever they happen to live. You shouldn't be able to switch back and forth depending on which cloud identity you're in, cloud identity system you're in. And then, again, centralized auditing and logging to provide that visibility across all of those systems to see bad behavior when it's happening. Any questions?
So you're saying if I had on-prem enterprise admin,
Right.
that same user should be a global admin in?
Well, not necessarily.
So what do you mean by don't mix and match?
So what I mostly mean is if I'm privileged on-prem with a particular identity, then that, well, it's the other way around that's more interesting. If I'm unprivileged on-prem, then that account in the cloud should not be privileged, right? So if in other words, don't mix privileged access with given a single identity, don't mix privileged access in one domain with unprivileged access in another. That's what I mean. Thanks a lot.